Chapter 30. Just like Jane Withers and Donald O'Connor, I was going on vacation. Daddy Bailey invited me to spend the summer with him in Southern California, and I was jumpy with excitement. Given our father's characteristic air of superiority, I secretly expected him to live in a manor house surrounded by grounds and serviced by a liveried staff. Mother was all cooperative in helping me to shop for summer clothes. With the haughtiness San Franciscans have for people who live in the warmer climate, she explained that all I needed were lots of shorts, pedal pushers, sandals, and blouses, because Southern Californians hardly ever wear anything else. Daddy Bailey had a girlfriend who had begun corresponding with me some months before, and she was to meet me at the train. We had agreed to wear white carnations to identify each other, and the porter kept my flower in the diner's Frigidaire until we reached the small hot town. On the platform, my eyes skimmed over the whites and searched among the Negroes who were walking up and down expectantly. There were no men as tall as Daddy, and no really glamorous ladies. I had decided that given his first choice, all his succeeding women would be startlingly beautiful. I saw a little girl who wore a white flower, but dismissed her as improbable. The platform emptied as we walked by each other time after time. Finally, she stopped me with a disbelieving, "Marguerite?" Her voice screeched with shock and maturity. So, after all, she wasn't a little girl. I, too, was visited with unbelief. She said, "I'm Dolores Stockland." Stunned, but trying to be well-mannered, I said, "Hello, my name is Marguerite." Daddy's girlfriend, I guessed her to be in her early 20s. Her crisp seersucker suit, spectator pumps, and gloves informed me that she was proper and serious. She was of average height, but with the unformed body of a girl, and I thought that if she was planning to marry our father, she must have been horrified to find herself with a nearly 6-foot prospective stepdaughter who was not even pretty. I found later that Daddy Bailey had told her that his children were 8 and 9 years old and cute as buttons. She had such a need to believe in him that even though we corresponded at a time when I loved the multisyllabic words and convoluted sentences, she had been able to ignore the obvious. I was another link in a long chain of disappointments. Daddy had promised to marry her, but kept delaying until he finally married a woman named Alberta, who was another small, tight woman from the South. When I met Dolores, she had all the poses of the black bourgeoisie without the material basis to support the postures. Instead of owning a manor house and servants, Daddy lived in a trailer park on the outskirts of town that was itself the outskirts of town. Dolores lived there with him and kept the house clean with the orderliness of a coffin. Artificial flowers reposed waxily in glass vases. She was on close terms with her washing machine and ironing board. Her hairdresser could count on absolute fidelity and punctuality. In a word, but for intrusions, her life would have been perfect. And then I came along. She tried hard to make me into something she could reasonably accept. Her first attempt, which failed utterly, concerned my attention to details. I was asked, cajoled, then ordered to care for my room. My willingness to do so was hampered by an unbounding ignorance of how it should be done, and a fumbling awkwardness with small objects. The dresser in my room was covered with little porcelain white women holding parasols, china dogs, fat-bellied cupids, and blown glass animals of every persuasion. After making the bed, sweeping my room, and hanging up the clothes, if and when I remembered to dust the bric-a-brac, I unfailingly held one too tightly and crunched off a leg or two, or too loosely and dropped it to shatter it into miserable pieces. Daddy wore his amused, impenetrable face constantly. He seemed positively diabolic in his enjoyment of our discomfort. Certainly Dolores adored her outsized lover and his elocution. Daddy Bailey never spoke. He orated, spiced with the rolling ers and errs, must have been some consolation to her in their less than middle class home. He worked in the kitchen of a naval hospital, and they both said he was a medical dietitian for the United States Navy. Their Frigidaire was always stocked with newly acquired pieces of ham, half roasts, and quartered chickens. Dad was an excellent cook. He had been in France during World War I and had also worked as doorman at the exclusive Breakers Hotel. As a result, he often made the continental dinners. We sat down frequently to côte de vin, prime rib au jus, and côtelette Milanese with all the trimmings. His specialty, however, was Mexican food. He traveled across the border weekly to pick up condiments and other supplies that graced our table as pollo en salsa verde and enchilada con carne. If Dolores had been a little less aloof, a little more earthy, she could have discovered that those ingredients were rife in her town proper, and Dad had no need to travel to Mexico to buy provisions, but she would not be caught so much as looking into one of the crusty Mexican mercados, let alone venturing inside its smelliness. And it also sounded ritzy to say, "My husband, Mr. Johnson, the naval dietitian, went over to Mexico to buy some things for our dinner." That goes over large with other ritzy people who go to the white area to buy artichokes. Dad spoke fluent Spanish, and since I had studied for a year, we were able to converse slightly. I believe that my talent with a foreign language was the only quality I had that impressed Dolores. Her mouth was too taut, and her tongue too still to attempt the strange sounds. Admittedly, though, her English, like everything else about her, was absolutely perfect. We indulged in a test of strength for weeks, as Dad stood figuratively on the sidelines, neither cheering nor booing, but enjoying himself greatly. He asked me once if I, liked, my mother. I thought he meant my mother, so I answered, yes, she's beautiful and gay and very kind. He said he wasn't talking about Vivian. He meant Dolores. Then I explained that I didn't like her because she was mean and petty and full of pretense. He laughed, and when I added she didn't like me because I was so tall and arrogant and wasn't clean enough for her, he laughed harder, and he said something like, "Well, that's life." One evening, he announced that on the next day he was going to Mexico to buy food for the weekend. There was nothing unusual about his pronouncement until he added that he was taking me along. He filled the shocked silence with the information that a trip to Mexico would give me an opportunity to practice Spanish. Dolores's silence might have been brought on by a jealous reaction, but mine was occasioned by pure surprise. My father had not shown any particular pride in me, and very little affection. He had not taken me to his friends or to Southern California's few points of interest. It was incredible that I was to be included in something as exotic as a trip to Mexico. Well, I quickly reasoned I deserved it. After all, I was his daughter, and my vacation fell far short of what I had expected a vacation to be. Had I protested that I would like Dolores to go along, we might have been spared a display of violence and near tragedy. But my young mind was filled with self, and my imagination shivered at the prospect of seeing sombreros, rancheros, tortillas, and Pancho Villa. We spent a quiet night. Dolores mended her perfect underwear, and I pretended to read a novel. Dad listened to the radio with a drink in his hand and watched what I now know was a pitiful spectacle. In the morning, we set out on the foreign adventure. The dirt roads of Mexico fulfilled all my longing for the unusual. Only a few miles from California's slick highways and, to me, tall buildings, we were bumping along on gravel streets that could have competed in crudeness with the worst paths in Arkansas, and the landscape boasted adobe huts or cabins walled with corrugated metal. Dogs, lean and dirty, slunk around the houses, and children played innocently in the nude, or near nude, with discarded rubber tires. Half the population looked like Tyrone Power and Dolores Del Rio, and the other half like Akim Damirov and Katina Paxinow, maybe only fatter and older. Dad gave no explanation as we drove through the border town and headed for the interior. Although surprised, I refused to indulge my curiosity by questioning him. After a few miles, we were stopped by a uniformed guard. He and Dad exchanged familiar greetings, and Dad got out of the car. He reached back into the pocket of the door and took a bottle of liquor into the guard's kiosk. They laughed and talked for over a half hour as I sat in the car and tried to translate the muffled sounds. Eventually they came out and walked to the car. Dad still had the bottle, but it was only half full. He asked the guard if he would like to marry me. Their Spanish was choppier than my school version, but I understood. My father added as an inducement the fact that I was only 15 years old. At once the guard leaned into the car and caressed my cheek. I suppose that he thought before that I was not only ugly but old too, and that now the knowledge that I was probably unused attracted him. He told Dad that he would marry me and would have many babies. We would have many babies. My father found that promise the funniest thing he had heard since we left home. He had laughed uproariously when Dolores didn't answer my goodbye, and I explained as we drove away that she hadn't heard. The guard was not discouraged by the attempts to get away from his probing hands, and I would have squirmed to the driver's seat had not Dad opened the door and got in. After many adioses and bonitos and espositas, Dad started the car, and we were on our grimy way again. Signs informed me that we were headed for Ensenada. In those miles along the twisted roads beside the steep mountain, I feared that I would never get back to America, civilization, English, and wide streets again. He sipped from the bottle and sang snatches of Mexican songs as we climbed the tortuous mountain road. Our destination turned out not to be the town of Ensenada, after all, but about 5 miles out of the city limits. We pulled up in the dirt yard of a cantina, where half-clothed children chased mean-looking chickens around and around. The noise of the car brought women to the door of the ramshackle building, but didn't distract the single-minded activity of either the grubby kids or the scrawny fowls. A woman's voice sang out, "Bailey, Bailey!" And suddenly a claque of women crowded to the door and overflowed into the yard. Dad told me to get out of the car, and we went to meet the women. He explained quickly that I was his daughter, which everyone thought to be uncontrollably funny. We were herded into a long room with a bar at one end. Tables sat lopsidedly on a loose plank floor. The ceiling caught and held my attention. Paper streamers in every possible color waved in the near, still air, and as I watched, a few fell to the floor. No one seemed to notice, or if they did, it was obviously unimportant that their sky was falling in. There were a few men on stools at the bar, and they greeted my father with the ease of familiarity. I was taken around, and each person was told my name and age. The formal high school "Cómo está usted?" was received as the most charming utterance possible. People clapped me on the back, shook Dad's hand, and spoke a rat-a-tat Spanish that I was unable to follow. Bailey was the hero of the hour, and as he warmed under the uninhibited show of affection, I saw a new side of the man. His quizzical smile disappeared, and he stopped his affected way of talking. It would have been difficult to wedge ers into the rapid Spanish.